so that you're not recorded eventually. So thank you very much for being here. I am Professor Lucia Re, and I'm speaking because this seminar is organized also within the course of Politics of Globalization and Human Rights of the University of Florence. So there are many students from my course who are connected today with us, and I hope that they will be interested in this focus that we are doing together with Carlo Botrugno on bioethics and racism. I'm just going to share for a minute the flyer that was prepared for today's meeting so that we can all look at the topic, which is biomedical research, genetics, and races. We have many important speakers with us today, so I welcome them and I thank them for being here. Katya, Gibel, Mevorach, Ruqaiijah, Yearby, and Celia Marana de Souza. And I give the floor to Carlo Botrugno, who organized this meeting and planned this meeting also within the courts, thanking him for doing that and giving us this important opportunity. Thank you, Carlo. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Lucia. Welcome, everybody. I'm Carlo Botrugno, the coordinator of the research unit on everyday bioethics and the ethics of science here at l'Altro Diritto Inter-University Center of the University of Florence. And I'm glad to be here for this second seminar of the Bioethics in Action seminar series 2, which is fully dedicated to bioethics and racism. We had an exciting start last Tuesday with excellent contribution by our speakers about the relationships between technological innovation in healthcare and racism. As you probably know, as you know for sure, because Lucia just told, these seminars are being recorded and made free available on our YouTube channel. So today we enter furthermore into the core of the problem by talking about biomedical research, genetics, and racism. Therefore, let me introduce our speakers of today. We have Katya Gibel Mevorach, who is a professor of anthropology and American studies at Grinnell College. Under name of Katya Gibel Azulai, she is author of Black, Jewish, and Interracial. It's not the color of your skin, but the race of your kin, and other myths of identity. Of course, she's also author of essays and papers that appear in prestigious journals, international journals in the field of bioethics, anthropology, African studies, among others. Then we have Ruqaiijah Yearby. Sorry, I was not good. Who is a professor and a member of the Center for Health Law Studies at St. Louis University School of Law. She's a co-founder and executive director of the Institute for Healing, Justice, and Equity at St. Louis University and co-principal investigator. Sorry, there is someone who is speaking with the... Okay. She's co-principal investigator for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant entitled Are Cities and Counties Ready to Use Racial Equity Tools to Influence Policy? Sounds very interesting. Professor Yearby is an expert of racial health disparities who advocate for equal access to quality healthcare and fair wage for racial, ethnic minorities, women, and the poor. And finally, also Celia Mariana Barbosa de Souza, who is a nurse at Clinical Hospital of Porto Alegre, where she works in the occupational medicine service. Particularly, she coordinates the Hetero-Identification Commission of the self-declared Black candidates to tenders. She's also a specialist in hospital management at Catholic Pontifical University and a specialist in nephrology nursing at the Rio Grande do Sul Federal University. She studies the relationship between kidney disease and the Black population since 2005. So thank you all of you for your availability, for being here with us. And not least, let me also introduce to all of you Alice Toyetta is a professional illustrator. You can see her screen who is active. And she has the challenging task of getting inspiration on our talks to drawing, to graphically represent what our speakers will discuss about. So it's something specially conceived to enrich these virtual meetings. So Alicia, we can wait to see your sketch. She will go, in the meantime, we will talk. So, and we will see again the sketch at the end of the session. So thanks, Alicia, for staying with us. I will immediately start by giving the floor to Professor Mevorach, who will talk about strategic intervention, uprooting racial taxonomy, and challenging racism in science courses. Thanks. Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Carla and Lucia. I will jump right in with my screen. Everybody can hear me? I'm in the United States. I'm in the middle of the United States in Iowa. I will have PowerPoint. The PowerPoint will complement what I'm saying. I won't be reading from the PowerPoint for the most part. My talk is inspired by a co-teaching project against race thinking under the umbrella of biology, and I hope to underline some points which may help your own approach to studying or participating in biomedical research and health professions. And my colleague, Leslie Gregg-Jolly, a molecular biologist, is actually in the audience today, so I'm grateful for her coming to here. We started drafting our course by acknowledging our intimidation with each other's academic disciplines. And this is
Professor, sorry, there is some noises, strong noises. Maybe if you talk a little bit, few centimeters far from the microphone, try.
Yes. Is this better?
Yes.
It
Yes.
seems, yeah.
And also, if I may ask, could you do a sort of presentation? Because here we see just the file
The screen
of your slides. I don't know if you have slideshow. If you could do the slideshow.
Do you see me now?
No,
Now we
it
see
disappeared.
you, but we don't see the screen.
Okay, let me put the screen back up with share. See?
And then F5, Professor. So
And did you say F5?
yes. Just a second. Now, try now. F5, try now.
Or even slideshow maybe.
Is this better?
If you go to play and start.
This is where I'm at. Play and start.
Okay.
Yes?
Yes, perfect. Yes, so that we see the slide.
You see a big orange?
No, we just see 1, 2, 3, and 4. Yes, now it's a big orange. Good science.
Okay.
Is the first.
What I see is there's a time delay.
Okay.
Okay. So my colleague and I, we acknowledge we both are intimidated. I'm intimidated by biology, and she's intimidated by the reflexive interpretive approach that we take often in social science. But we called the course Racing Through Genetics so that race would be seen as an action verb. And we point out to our students from the very beginning that a primary question is, what difference does difference make? And my colleague defined good science as the goal, the objective goal of the course when students walk away. And so good science then is specifically defined as surprises based on data upside down and backwards. Bad science glances at the data with an eye to confirm preconceived suspicion. And preconceived suspicion is going to be prescriptive. Now, the slide that you see right now complements what I'm about to say. It's not direct, but you may read it. Although our course is designed for undergraduates, one long-term objective has been to bring the insights to colleagues at our institutions and other places. The main challenge that we face is disentangling misconceptions about human difference and sociopolitically defined demographic categories that biology professors and health professionals use. Because students are educated by professors and then become researchers, professors, and professionals, we explicitly recognize that science syllabi usually do not include material from the social sciences or the humanities. This serious omission must be addressed if biologists, geneticists, and other scientists are to understand the role that science has played in the construction of racial classifications and how these racial classifications themselves continue to impact research, diagnosis, and treatment in ways that are misleading and even harmful. A key intervention is to historicize and contextualize biomedical and genetic research as a prerequisite for becoming attentive to the trace of scientific racism that percolates into medicalization of race in pharmaceutical, medical, and genetic research. Our approach clarifies the problem of prescriptive thinking when it comes to deeply embedded and internalized ideas of race-based difference, which bias research questions and projects. So first of all, race is a classificatory system and requires criteria. It's going to take a while for this screen to catch up with my talk. All race categories rely on selective ancestry as their criteria and necessarily bracket, parenthesize, inconvenient exceptions. Race is not a salient noun. Race is an action verb. You cannot buy it at the grocery store or the pharmacy. Race is a predicate. In the Americas, that is both in North America, Central America, and South America, in the Americas, people are still being raced under variations of three abstract aggregate labels: Black, white, and mixed. This doesn't mean that other people aren't raced differently, but those are the three big categories that we often hear. In contrast, many countries in Europe exclude race as a category in their population data. The pernicious whisper of biological difference remains a stark reminder that Nazi scientific racism culminated with the Shoah, or with the Holocaust. And for those of you in Italy, the reminder would, of course, be Mussolini. If researchers educated in Europe are discouraged from using race as an analytic unit in their demographic surveys and population studies, the taboo is disregarded when they join American peers and publish or deliver papers in English. Let me be more precise then about history and context and share some images which illustrate this. So you have on screen a Virginia Act in 1662. In the 17th century, the late 17th century, British colonists who settled across the Atlantic realized they needed to define the status of slaves and the criteria for permanent bondage. Why? Because African enslaved women raped, for the most part raped, almost always raped, by English men became pregnant and gave birth to babies. So the question was, are these babies free or slave? And Virginia was the first American colony to address the question in the context of legal property. The child follows the status of the mother. Other colonies quickly followed suit. Color was never the determining factor of who was free and who was slave. It was not included in the legal definition, only the status of the mother, and this continued until the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary bondage in the United States. But consider the framework. The American colonies became independent in 1776, accommodating the contradiction between freedom and slavery. By the end of the 18th century, trade in human beings across the transatlantic route was still profitable for wealthy English, Spanish, British, and Americans. But note, the French were overthrown in Saint-Domingue by African descent slaves in the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution I mentioned because it's often forgotten how important it was and how impoverished Haiti has become. Around the same period, German naturalist, the first perhaps anthropologist, Johann Blumenbach, was creating categories for human variation. The obsession with human variation and classification would prove instructive when folded into a taxonomy of race, which became foundational to the professionalized science of race, married to anthropology, anatomy, and medicine. European and American scientists would use the authority of science to provide theoretical artillery that rationalized slavery and legitimized inequality. And here it is worth noting that there has never been a consensus on how many races there are within the human species, nor a consensus over what constitutes racial purity. The debates themselves are evidenced, sometimes with ridicule, in United States, in American deliberations in court over race category and how to assign it to which individual. One mystery should be solved. We can map the timeline for the shift from a science of race to ideological scientific racism and the search for essential immutable biological difference. At this point, because our college is in the United States, we ask students to look up science categories, U.S. Census categories, We ask them to look up U.S. Census categories, beginning with the first in 1790, and to report on their findings. And the question that they're asked, are the categories of the census consistent over time, and what are the changes? Here they confront an archive, not an interpretation, which show that white is the one category that always shows up on the census, but it is also the only category that is contested and defined by what it is not. It is defined by acrobatic exclusions. So here we have a picture, and just for you to see quickly what the picture is, the question here is the child Black? Is the child African American? How do you know? How do you know which child is free? And the answer is in the following. I think you may have a delay, but you will see a child who looks like a girl with white skin and a boy who looks like a child with brown skin. And these two children are from 1863, and they were poster children for the abolition movement. But anybody in 1863 living in the South would have known that this child is white and this child is black, but they're both African, they're both Negroes, and they're both slaves. Color made no difference. How would they know? By the intimacy with which the girl's hand is enfolded in the body, in the arm of the black child. So these are both slaves, and they're both what would, after slavery, be called Negroes. And to this day, the idea that she is white would be contested because of African ancestry. Same with this photo. It's a well-known photo. All of the people would be considered colored or Negro. And in the United States, the idea of mulatto exists for a very, very brief period. So, race. I'm going to pause this for a moment. And so ignore the screen. You can read it, but you can also ignore it. Scientific racism championed class prejudice and is particularly evident in the literature on racial difference in European fields of ethnology and anthropology. For the United States, where our students read about poor whites, they also have to encounter the reality, which continues today, that poor whites are seen often as discardable and racially inferior. Our students read an excerpt from Francis Galton, who coined the term eugenics in 1883 to define the science of improving stock, followed by an infamous judicial decision of the United States Supreme Court, which said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. The students are shocked to discover that this particular attitude was seen as quite progressive. Eugenics, of course, leads to Nazi scientific racism and their genocidal policies toward Jews, about which many of our students know very little. I think perhaps in Europe, students may be more familiar with the history of Nazism and the rise of Hitler. So we have our students look at this graph. We have them look up information about Nazi scientific racism. And we have them watch the film Nuit et Brouillard by Alain Resnais. Some of you may be familiar with the film director Alain Resnais. And the message in the text resonates with students, even as they're shocked by the images and asked to be secondhand witnesses to the unforgivable and the unforgettable. But this film and the graphs of the Nazis shows to our students and to some of our colleagues with little information about history that white skin was never a criteria for belonging to the white race. Today, Americans are having a moment of racial reckoning, and the focus on whiteness and privilege overshadows attention to poverty, geography, and the impact of systematic economic discrimination and disparity. At the same time, COVID-19 highlights both the politics of inequality and simultaneously the unreliability of research which uses backdoor race categories disguised as population genetics. I argue that while social science theories have pushed open meaningful debates about race, racism, class, and gender, these theories can also mislead and misrepresent cause for effect. When this seeps into biomedical research, what is misleading can become a health hazard. Having established a framework for students to map the history and impact of race and people in the United States, we ask students to look at other countries and look at their population statistics. The base of comparison is the United States, and the vocabulary is very important. In the United States, there are 4 federally mandated race categories, and these are the mandated race categories. There's also 1 ethnic category, and that 1 ethnic category consumes Latinos/Hispanics. It is defined as those who are coming from Spanish-speaking countries south of the United States. But the main racial categories are white, Black or African American, American Indian or Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander, and of course these categories themselves are problematic. By looking at other countries, our students discover that American categories are very poor search terms outside the US. Outside the US, ethnicity, national origin, sometimes language, sometimes religion, sometimes no population data are the organizing analytic units. Does this mean that racism, xenophobia, prejudice, discrimination are absent? Absolutely not. Should we continue to use social categories like race as a tool to monitor discrimination? I think we should, but only because it provides one effective way to establish comparisons for differential treatment, without which it would be difficult to prove discrimination. Having noted this, however, the question remains: if countries have no race categories and therefore do not collect data on race, what criteria do their researchers use for grouping people in biomedical and genetic studies? Do population labels travel? And how do they translate in the lab by people who carry out biomedical research? Because science is a collaborative effort, when individuals are socialized in different communities, different environments, educated in different schools, and come together as research teams, there is necessarily an exchange of ideas. What happens in the lab or the clinic is affected by what happens outside. My argument here is that in the area of medical research, diagnosis, and treatment, categorization of the human beings that infer racial taxonomy, racial categories, and racial derivatives should be relegated to the historiography of scientific racism and viewed as bad science. Human variation based on subjective and learned differences are rooted in histories, political, economic, legal. These histories have definitely biological consequences which impact the health and well-being of humans. Therefore, examining the legacies of discriminatory racist legislation and policies which become embedded in society and have consequential generational negative impact need to be abolished. For this reason, while researchers examining health disparities need to take into account the legacy and impact of institutionalized racism, they must also commit to drafting new data schemes in their research projects on people. Scientists need to unlearn the biases of the societies in which they live and refuse to take on the biases in the places they move to work. And this is often difficult. Consider the analogy, the impossibility of pulling up a rug if you're standing on it. The classificatory system of race is the rug. It is familiar, unthreatening, and very predictable, but it is no longer the best tool to fight racism, xenophobia, nationalism, and fundamentalism. Research questions about health and illness of human beings need precision, not prescriptive investigations. Prioritizing attention to the political, socioeconomic environment, the variables that differentiate, discriminate, and have negative impact should take precedence over personal and collective identities. Consider the calamitous impact of finding stem cell and organ donors according to identities. This is where bureaucratic classifications of race and the sanitized cousin ethnicity, I paused so that you'd have a chance to see the screen, which I know is on delay. Ethnicity often uses culture as a metonym for race. These dangerously intersect with focused attention on genetic ancestry that are fine in the commercial arena of recreation and are terrible in the arena of research. The treatment for the worst cases of blood cancer is stem cell matching. One would think that donor and recipient would be matched through a random computer search, and it is for some people. The problem is that individuals feed the computer based on how they index groups of people. Where race categories are used, and these are always based on selective ancestry, the outcome is predetermined to be based on race. So when donors and recipients are matched, as in Be the Match, according to race categories that are rebranded as ethnic categories, the chances for finding a match are already hampered by essentialist ideas of biological difference and misguided understandings of statistical probability and genetic research. The prevailing myth that mixed race people need their own registry is egregious and evidences the longevity of racialized ideas woven into ideas about genetic distinctiveness. And I have a personal example of that because my son almost died of leukemia. And in the hospital, the doctor said, "This is very serious. We need to find a transplant donor. Now, tell me, you're African American and your son is Israeli?" And I looked at him stunned at the question, particularly because of my area of study. And I said, let's just get to the point and not discuss theory. And then I told him my background. My mother is a refugee from Nazi Austria. My father is from Jamaica. His mother was from the Dominican. His father was Cuban. And the doctor looked at me and said, "Oh, good, I'm Canadian. I understand. We'll go to the International Bank." I answered and said, "Can we just start with my children?" And fortunately, my daughter was the stem cell donor. Now, we all are mixed. That is the nature of human beings. The tenacity of racial theories of difference and the willful refusal to differentiate social political fact from biological fiction is infuriating precisely because when we send students on to the literature using keywords race and ethnicity added to a medical disease or a medical illness, they discover volumes of current academic research taking place based on racial difference, based on ethnic difference. One reason may be due to vain virtue, which is self-congratulation for quick solutions, which address inequality in a way that in fact reinforce essentialist ideas about identity. And remember, identities are plural, political, and public. They're not inscribed into our DNA except metaphorically. And therefore, regardless of how respondents identify or are identified by bureaucratic categories, researchers need to interrogate the efficacy of these racial classifications and their scientific euphemisms. But in the United States, at least, this is complicated by ways that scientists have interpreted a very important act, the Minority Health and Improvement Disparity Elimination Act. And what was the act supposed to do? It was intended to conduct and support research, training, dissemination of information, and other programs with respect to minority health conditions and other populations with health disparities. The intent of the act was to intervene against omissions in medical research. However, researchers seeking funding misinterpreted the invitation to reinscribe the same essentials categories in their research project. Embedded in the mandate is a magic of racecraft, which presupposes and is premised on genetic variation between predefined racial and ethnic minority populations. In other words, in order for researchers to seek funding successfully, they had to comply with the directives of the mandate. And complying meant integrating minority groups with the vocabulary of race and ethnicity based on the US Census and the US Census racial categories. What is needed is a reconceptualization of populations from the outset. And the only way to do this is to make clear the difference between socio-political differences and physiological differences. And so I want to conclude by giving you two examples that I find to be quite troubling, and I hope that you will find them troubling as well. The first, which is an indication for me of willful ignorance, is the display of the medicalization of race labels on over-the-counter medications, at least in the United States, over-the-counter medications for osteoporosis, which specifically target and mention Asian and Caucasian women. And remember, Caucasian is always a race term that Blumenbach invented. The second is a research project that evaluates baby and toddler recognition of racial difference in their reaction to female adult women with Black and white faces. And here I would ask you both to remember the two slave children that I showed you from 1863, and also to look at the people, or to think in your minds of the people, the many people that you know who may be in your family, may live in your building near where you are in your classroom. Those of you who are parents or who have younger siblings, think of what baby and toddlers do when they run around and they see new people. So I hope that you cringe at the idea of a research project evaluating recognition of racial difference, which babies have. But this was a collaborative international project carried out by a white Anglo-American Protestant from the Midwest and a Chinese researcher in China. And because the application for funding was submitted in the United States, the proposal was defined and drafted to meet their understanding that race had to be central to the project. Yet nothing in the proposal hinted at an understanding of how babies are socialized to note familiar and stranger, or why the researchers presumed in advance that racial difference and skin color were the same notions. Their project is not unusual, as I say. You can go through the science literature and you will find that race and ethnicity and the criteria that are used for population groups are not explained, even though they are the backbone of the research project. And so my final words are the following. We are living in a moment with a pandemic that has put the world on pause and has forced medical researchers and geneticists to innovatively, creatively figure out remedial interventions. The same year that the American Minorities and Health Disparities Research and Education Act passed, British sociologist Paul Gilroy made an appeal for liberation from, and I quote, racialized seeing, racialized thinking, and racialized thinking about thinking as the only ethical response to the conspicuous wrongs that raciologies continue to solicit and sanction. We are not yet post-COVID, and many countries remain either in lockdown or lockout. But Paul Gilroy's appeal remains urgent and relevant. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for this very nice presentation. You put on the ground so many interesting topics, from the ambivalence of the notion of race to medicalization, and also thanks for sharing your personal experience. I will ask you to stop the show screen so as to give the floor to Professor, to Professor Yearby, who will talk about race-based medicine, colorblind disease, and how racism in medicine harms us all. Professor Yearby, you have the floor.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you to you and Lucia for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen. And there's definitely some overlap in the presentations. And so this presentation builds off of an article that I published. It came out in December and then in print this year, called Race-Based Medicine, Colorblind Disease, How Racism in Medicine Harms Us All. And it's in the American Journal of Bioethics. And so I'm going to skip a lot of my introductory discussion because it was already covered. But I am going to go through and talk about in detail how race-based medicine is a part of not only biomedical research, but again, health disparities research and treatment, and how it actually does harm us all, and not just the racial and ethnic minorities that tend to be left out. And so just want to highlight some of these terms again, right, that when we talk about race, that we don't have one key definition. We have used various ways of defining it. Skin color, as was mentioned, the one-drop rule, which goes back to the Virginia law, which was upheld in 1985 in a Louisiana case where a woman was not deemed white because her 5 generations back, she had Black ancestry. We look at self-identification and ancestry, as was noted, particularly because we are moving towards ancestry testing. And so just like the previous scholar, professor, I wanted to highlight some pictures here and just go through the ways that race is misapplied. So the first person on the left is Carol Channing. And as was noted, right, when we think about skin color, we would tend to perceive her as white, but her father's mother was Black. And so if we go on skin color, she's white. If we go on ancestry, then she's Black. The next person is Wentworth Miller, who is an actor. His father is African-American, Jamaican, German, and English. Again, this goes on the one-drop rule. He would be considered Black. The next person is Jessica Krug, who was an American historian who identified as Black and Latino, but she was actually white, right? And so in terms of self-identification, it is not clear how we should identify particular people, particularly as they choose their identities that is not based on any link to their biological or ancestry. And then finally, when we look at Tiger Woods, if we base it on the largest percentage of ancestry, his ancestry is 25% African, 25% Chinese, 12.5% Native American, 25% Thai, and 12.5% Dutch. right? And so the question becomes, how do we treat these particular people? And I want to highlight them before I move on, how this impacts various research endeavors and treatment. So when we think about healthcare disparities research, if we think about skin color, then the question becomes, how should we actually treat Carol Channing? Should she be labeled as white or should she be labeled as Black? Do we measure a person's melanin? So do we go across the board? Sorry. Do we go across the board and try to determine how they look? Or is it rather how they're viewed and treated by society? The same thing could be asked about Jessica Krug, who may have self-identified as Black, but if we think about sort of her experiences, would they have been the same as someone who had ancestry as Black? And finally, when we think about cholesterol levels and the different standards, we often have different standards for Blacks, whites, South Asians, and East Asians. So if we take a look at Tiger Woods and his percentage of ancestry, what cholesterol standard would we have used? Would we have used Black, white, South Asian, or East Asian for him? And so why this is important, because in the article I discuss how the continued misuse of race is actually an example of racism in medicine, in other areas, including public health and law, which I study as well. But that racism is an organized social system in which the dominant group, based on ideology of inferiority, categorizes and ranks people into social groups called races and uses its power to devalue, disempower, and differentially allocate valued societal resources and opportunities to groups defined as inferior. And for the rest of my talk, I'm going to talk about the ways that the misuse of race actually is an example. It's an example of connecting racial and ethnic minorities to a belief that they are inferior, devaluing them, even when whites tend to also suffer poor health. And so I just want to highlight some old and recent studies that have misused and misclassified race. The most notable one is the sickle cell anemia from 1947, published in JAMA. And I'll talk about this more later. The racial ethnic variation in nasal gene expression, again, published in JAMA, and was an article to discuss why we saw increased rates of infection for COVID-19 and deaths because there was some racial and ethnic variation in nasal genes for Blacks and Latinos. When we go up, there's some other recent stories. Sorry, not stories. I think about them as stories because they're not grounded in any scientific definition of race. But here, obesity in African Americans, the role of physiology, again, published in an esteemed medical journal, which talks about somehow there's a biological difference in Black women. And so that's why they tend to be or have an increased rate of obesity. And so when we think about misuse of biomedical research, thankfully I don't have to go through this as much because it was definitely discussed in detail, but I just want to highlight some key points to reiterate. It goes into what we study, right? It goes into the fact that sickle cell has been labeled a Black disease, and so we do not study it. We do not train people to be able to treat it. It goes into our hypotheses, and you can see that from the studies that were published from my last slide of actually including race in the question related to some disease or health disparities. It's the populations used for research. And here I'm building on the work of Harriet Washington and her great book, Medical Apartheid, where she talks about how they decided to study violence and perhaps genetics of violence, but they only tracked Black and Latino children. And it's also the populations that benefit from research. And we see this currently with the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine, right? That there was research done around the world, but not everybody has access to the vaccine. I am going to focus a majority of the rest of my discussion on the misuse of race and how it is an example of racism, particularly in terms of health disparities research, medical guidelines, and standards of care. And I will be building on these 2 points that minorities are inferior and whites are superior in the standard. And so that's what we see. And so, as I said, I'm going to highlight these 3 particular areas that show racism. So when we look at infant mortality, and I apologize, a lot of the data that I'm going through is really US focused, but I know we can see the same thing in other countries. So when we look at infant mortality, particularly in the United States, there is a lot of discussion about the differences in infant mortality between Blacks and whites. And that leads us to believe that somehow that whites are the standard. They are not. When we look at racial groups that and birth outcomes, Asians have the lowest infant mortality rate of 3.6 per 1,000 live births, followed by whites and Latinos that are about 4.9, and then Blacks, which have a rate of 11.4. Why is this important? Because when you do a comparison between Blacks and whites, you do not see that whites are also suffering from high infant mortality rates. And so you do not support their need and provide extra care for them. But it also reifies this belief that they should be the standard when they are not the best. And the same thing could be said when we think about COVID-19. So I'm going to jump there and then get to the middle of the other diseases that I'm covering. In the United States, what we see is that Asians actually have the lowest number of cases in the United States and about the same numbers of hospitalizations and deaths as whites. And so again, whites are traditionally talked about as a standard and superior when compared to Blacks and Latinos, but they are not the standard. And if you do not use the group that is actually having the best health outcomes, then you do not actually learn what is helpful for all of us. What are the things that they are doing that perhaps we can adopt? When we take a look at overall health, just again wanted to highlight some areas. Numerous studies indicate that whites had greater health decline than Blacks and Latinos during the 2012 economic downturn, equal or poor health, mental health than Blacks, worse physical health than Asians on many measures, and poorer health outcomes when compared to groups in other countries. And why I'm highlighting this, not to highlight that somehow whites are inferior, but really to highlight the fact that if we are so concerned with health disparities, then we need to actually support all those in the US and across the world who are suffering from health disparities to figure out what are the conditions, the structural inequities, and other things that lead to poor health outcomes, and then actually address that. I'm going to highlight one more thing, but please feel free to ask me questions about life expectancy. I do want to highlight experiencing racism, because oftentimes some of the reasons that we say that we are continuing to use race is because we want to track how people experience racism and how it negatively impacts their health outcomes. But again, we assume that it just impacts racial and ethnic minorities. In the United States, it doesn't. There's research that has shown that being a current smoker increased by 24% for those who reported experiencing general racism sometimes, and by 95% for those who reported experiencing general racism often or all the time compared with those who did not. And that's across all racial groups. So the assumption that racism just harms people of color, racial and ethnic minorities is not true. It harms everybody in the United States, which is in part why our health outcomes are so bad. It is also linked to the odds of binge drinking and obesity, which we know are risk factors for cancer and heart conditions and various other health outcomes. So we can already see how racism impacts health disparities research. It also leads to the corruption of knowledge. And so when we think about, and particularly students are taught in medical school about why race is so important, they always raise this issue of sickle cell, that there is a Black disease. And I just want to highlight, sickle cell is not a Black disease. It is a disease which protects people against malaria. And so we find it all across the world, including in Italy, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Burma, Greece. It has been labeled a Black disease, in part because researchers decided when they began to identify the people who were first suffering from the disease, they were of mixed race, and because of their racism, decided that it was the Black part that had corrupted the purity of whiteness. And so that's why we have labeled it as a Black disease, and it has continued. But being labeled as a Black disease that everybody is taught about in medical school, they're never taught how to treat it, right? And so everybody can say sickle cell is a Black disease, but they can never say, how do we treat it? It lacks money for research, and many people are denied pain treatment. Why is this important? Because what it does is that it separates out and prevents people from being treated, right? Because we don't put training in it and we don't put money in it, but we also then do not test people who do not appear to be Black for sickle cell, which means that they are never identified and they do not actually get treatment. And in fact, you can see discussions about doctors not wanting to treat, not wanting to test white people, because then it would call into question their heritage. So I want to highlight unequal treatment, and then I am going to finish up with some just additional readings for you. So when we think about racism, again, the continuing use of misuse of race, we see that it often leads to unequal treatment. Initially, and probably still so, when we think about some of the symptom guidelines for COVID-19, they note that one of the ways to determine it is the pink and white COVID toes. So again, not discussing symptoms in a way that includes racial and ethnic minorities or even people with darker skin. We see the same case in pressure sores. Many of the reading materials or discussions about pressure sores often focus on how it presents in whites and not people of color. Most recently, there's been a lot of discussion about pulse oximeters, who track, right, the accuracy of oxygen saturation, but they have been found not to be as effective in patients with darker skin. And so again, we can see how racism plays a part, because we are not actually including information about how diseases show up in people of darker skin. And that does not necessarily just track to races, but there's a whole issue about colorism, which I don't have time to talk about here, which is also a part of racism. Finally, I'm going to highlight issues around breast cancer. Much research has been done on the fact, particularly in the United States, the fact that Black women tend to have higher death rates than white women from breast cancer. But unfortunately, again, we have connected this to some biological difference when there is none. Much of the data that we can see, and again, this builds off of Dorothy Roberts, her great book, Fatal Invention, where she actually tracked breast cancer death rates in Chicago and saw that between 1980 and 2005 that the death rates for Black and white women were the same. By 2006, Black women were more than 2 times likely to die from breast cancer compared to white women. And as I always tell my students and during these talks, that from my knowledge, nothing happened that so shifted the genetics of Black women in Chicago from 2005 to 2006, right? There wasn't a meteor, there wasn't a climate change event that somehow miraculously changed the genetics of Black women. What we do see is that there was a shift in actual access to mammograms during that time. And so that many of the Black women who died received their diagnosis in later stages. And we see the same problems sort of carry through in triple negative breast cancer. That even though research has shown that increased rates of triple negative breast cancer are connected to socioeconomic status, Medicaid insurance, living in the Midwest and the South and having multiple comorbidities, right? All structural inequities. And clearly, we would never say that somebody living in the Midwest and the South of the United States is genetically different or inferior compared to those living on the West Coast or the Northeast. But what we tend to do is make that distinction between Black women where there is no connection. And so with that, I will just end my talk just to highlight these are some of the articles that I pulled from in this presentation, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Professor Yearby. Very interesting presentation, extremely clear. So I appreciated many things actually, among which the ideology of inferiority, which has which evokes clearly the relations of power and oppression Black people are suffering. And also the role of information you underscored, which was a topic during the first seminar with, in particular with Suzica May, which, if I'm not wrong, is connected also. So thanks again for your presentation. Before to make a jump to focus more on the situation of Brazil with Celia Mariana de Souza, I would like to invite our participants to make some questions in our chat. If you want to ask something to our speakers, please do it in our chat, and then we will pass the questions. And yes, Professor, Dr. Celia Mariano, you have the floor. We can hear you. Wait a minute. Should activate your audio.
Okay, just a moment.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Professor, you can speak. We hear you.
Sim, genau.
Are you looking for how to share your presentation?
Just a moment, just a moment.
Esse número aqui, ó.
Aqui.
488. 1318.
Okay.
Não. Okay.
Carlos, just a moment. I am technology. Just a moment.
Célia, precisa de alguma ajuda?
Eu não estou conseguindo inserir ali, ó. Só um pouquinho.
In the meantime, we're going to see the drawings of Alicia in the meantime. Alicia, can you hear me?
Carlo, there is also a question on the chat.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to read
Yeah,
it, then eventually the previous speakers can try to answer to this question while we're waiting for Professor De Souza.
Okay, Celia, we're going to make some question to our to Yearby and Katya and come back to you in a few minutes, okay?
Okay.
Fine. Okay, there is this question by Maria Grace. I would like to ask what are the epistemological problems which allow this racist science to keep reproducing itself? Don't you think it's a consequence of modernity and its science, which is advertised as a social, a historical, neutral, rational? So it is possible to overcome racist practices without questioning the very foundation and the myths of modernity. So a very good question. I would like Professor Mevorach first to give a comment or answer.
Well, I think Professor Yearby will agree completely. If scientists are not learning the history of racist science practices, then they continue to reproduce bad science. I'll give one example of, if one takes the United States, or I'm not familiar enough with the literature of the Caribbean, but all over, we can take fiction, we can take a newspaper fiction, we can take a newspaper article, and we can take a science paper from 1850 or 1860 and present it to scientists and see, do you not understand the circulation of ideas about biologizing difference as it develops over time? And the last point, so I can leave time for Ruqaiijah to respond as well. Scientists don't learn that difference is everywhere. It's in the Bible. We're not all the same. Some are tall, some are short, some are wide, some are narrow. Babies recognize difference, but you have to be taught what kind of difference to think is significant and to think makes you superior. So, it's like everybody knows Herodotus divided the world by language, and those that didn't speak his language were barbarians.
Thanks.
Yes, I want to add to that. We replicated in not teaching the history. We replicated in what we fund. We replicated in what we publish, right? And so this continuing focus, as you mentioned, of NIH, of CDC, particularly in the US, but across the world in terms of what do we fund. And so we do tend to fund things that highlight race. And I will say, because I realized I didn't mention this initially in my talk, is that I'm not saying get rid of racial categories, but stop using them as ways to actually connect to some outcome, right? That we should also include culture, where you are, your location, right? All the things that come into play, your employment, because those all have a part of to play in terms of our health, in terms of our diseases, and in terms of our outcomes. So I agree that it is also talking about science as neutral. And in the past, science is the way to save us, but then we just replicate the same problems that we have outside of science inside it.
Thanks. It's very nice to see how people with very different backgrounds really converge on this, on references they do. It's really important. And the message came out from your presentation was very clear. I particularly appreciate it. In the meantime, Celia.
I rose my hand just to make. Can we open the debate also for the students eventually?
Yeah.
Okay, so I invite the students to ask questions and to feel free to ask questions, even if maybe the level of the debate is a bit high for their background. But please feel free to ask questions. You can write them on the chat or just show up and raise your hand. Um,
Just
so I see that Professor
yeah.
Barbosa, however, is saying that maybe Professor Kamei can show her slides, and so that
What
they
she
are
talks.
ready. So maybe we can do the debate later, and students and scholars who are connected can just think about them and write them in the chat.
Let's see if we are able to do this.
I have a question as well. So. Maybe they're still trying, Carlo, I think.
Yeah,
So may I
think it's
ask a
better.
question? May I ask the question? Maybe it's a very stupid question, and
No, come on.
but maybe it could be interesting for the students too. Because in Italy, we had this debate about using or not using the word race also in legal texts. And it was, this idea was examined by the Constitutional Court because we only have the word race in the article that prohibits discrimination, race discrimination. We do not use this category. And we have a really poor collection of data about the population. Just some medical data are collected also using this word, because we have this memory of fascism and the Russia laws. And so we feel that it's a very sensitive issue, and that we don't want to use that word. But in the end, our Constitutional Court, for example, said that that word should stay in our legal text because we have to have this memory. So we cannot just erase the reference to race, because this would erase the same idea of racism and discrimination. So I would like to know, and in Germany there was this similar debate, and they proposed to abolish, I think they proposed to abolish this word from the legal texts of the European Union. I would like to know what is your opinion about how to put discrimination in evidence without referring to race. How can you do that? In Italy, for example, we have this problem with the Roma people because we do not collect data about them. We almost have no data about them, but they are deeply discriminated. So if I understood well, your argument is that this categorization is wrong, but at the same time, I wonder how can we address discrimination, also in science, of course. Thank you.
Maybe I'll go first, and Ruqaiijah, then you. From a legal standpoint, my standpoint, okay, I have the passport of my grandparents and my mother when they were able, them and not my great-grandmother, for whom I'm named, to get out of Nazi Austria. And the passport which they have has Juden, as a race. In America, they enter, and it's listed as Hebrew. The question is that you're asking specifically for this seminar, otherwise it's too long. Race categories were used. The categories that Italy used, that Austria used, that Germany used, are not the categories that the Americans use. How many races are there? You go through the history of racing people, and the numbers can go from 4 to 60. The question it really is whether those are the categories to use when medical scientists and doctors and nurses are making a diagnosis or deciding treatment or carrying out a research project. And so at base, there has to be a clear definition of the criteria that are going to be used for grouping, in other words, for the groups that are going to be under study in the sciences. And that's not quite the same thing as being able to track discrimination by the way that people are raced: Jews, Roma, Armenians, and so forth. And in China, there are 50 groups in China. How are they raced? How are they divided by population group? And how do they face discrimination? That's what's key.
Yes, and I will respond really quickly. Oh, because I know we want to get to our next speaker, but I agree. The problem, even when you include race, is it does not mean that you will get to all of the discrimination. And so there were cases in the United States where particular people were Latino, but they were perceived as Black. And so the question really became, were they discriminated against based on racism? Because they were not Black, or at least didn't consider themselves Black, but that's how they were perceived. And so to me, the key really is trying to figure out a way to treat each other better and to track discrimination and put an end to it. And if it helps by starting to include race in the law, then yes, I think we should. But again, as was mentioned, right, that's so different than science. But if you put race in a law, then you should be open to actually addressing the discrimination that impacts everybody differently, but impacts everybody. Because as a quote that I always think about is that you cannot be at your best health while you're holding somebody down, right? Because it keeps you down as well. And so I think that's part of the key in what we're talking about in terms of health. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
So now, with the help of Susie Kamei, we are here to give the floor to Celia
Okay.
for her talk.
Okay, you listening?
Yeah.
Sorry about this problem. So sorry. But good afternoon. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Carlos, for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with the important scientists. Okay, this show is very well important, and my study. Okay, my study. I am Celia. I am a nurse. I live in South Brazil.
Maybe she should turn her camera off. And maybe we can do the same to help the connection. I don't know. Carlo, maybe.
No, I think she had problem also even before the very start of the meeting. I'm not
Yes, but
sure.
if she has a weak connection, if we turn off the cameras, maybe it will be better for her. We can try just
But
to.
she has no, I don't know.
Professor, can you hear us? I don't see anything in the chat as well.
No. I don't know. Maybe the best will be to
I will try to call to her, and I will give some return to you.
Okay, maybe we can just go on with the debate, Carlo.
Yeah, I think the best will be to record the intervention of Celia another time and then to add on YouTube because it's very complicated. So let's go ahead with the debate. I would like to say something to invite our speakers on another comment. I always have in mind a sentence by Boaventura de Sousa Santos, a philosopher and sociologist of law, very well known. He says we have the right to be treated as equal when difference is a disadvantage, and to be treated as the different way when the difference is part of us. From this, it claims the need for inequality that recognizes the differences and the difference that do not produce, feed, or reproduce inequality. If we focus on healthcare, in the healthcare system, what will be a point of balance for you in the organization of healthcare system in practice among considering the difference and equality or struggling racism and discrimination? Professor Mevorach,
I can jump in.
I'll let Tia go for Professor Yearby go first.
So I would say for me, during President Obama's term, he focused on precision medicine, that part of the ways that we really need to improve healthcare is by focusing on what individuals are suffering and are experiencing. And so that allows us to take into consideration their individual difference to tailor specifically to the things that they need. And so I was hoping that we would get to that point. In terms of care, in terms of how we treat people, because as you mentioned, right, that we may be different, but we may suffer some of the same things because we live in the same neighborhood, right? And so here in the United States, research has actually shown that Blacks and whites that live together tend to have the same health outcomes. Why? Because they're living in the same spaces and places. So because we don't know necessarily what are major things that impact our health, we should track all of those and try to understand how some differences are important and some are not. And some of them will link across perhaps racial and cultural groups, and some of them really won't. And so if we treat people as individuals, try to collect as much information as possible, then we can support their better health. So I'll stop there.
Carlo, I see Professor Barbosa. I don't know if she's able to hear us and to talk. But Professor Mevorach also has to reply, maybe.
Oh, I'm only going to say that Professor Yearby answered the question perfectly.
Are you hearing us, Professor Barbosa?
Just to say yes.
Yes, I show now. Susie, please. Next, please, Susie, please. Okay, I'm so sorry. Well, so chronic disease is a worldwide public health problem. You listen? You listen?
Not very well, maybe. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. And now? And now?
Better. I think it's better now. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Então, chronic disease is a worldwide public health problem. It is estimated that 10% of the Brazilian population has chronic kidney disease. It's not clear, okay? I use the data United States because we don't have data in Brazil about this topic. In the United States, ancestor individual develop end-stage renal disease, especially in association with hypertension, is rate 4 to 5 times higher than the people without African ancestry. In this stage, the kidney doesn't work anymore. This individual need hemodialysis 3 times 4 weeks, okay? And no, Susie, here. And this stage, the individual, so need hemodialysis 3 times 4 weeks. And each time it's 4 hours. your life changed. Next, Susie. Next, Susie. The show is the higher rate of Afro-American compared to other population. Próximo, Suzy. Next. Next, Suzy, please. 30% of Afro-American carriers of G1 plus G2 have a higher risk of developing kidney disease, such as primary focal segmental glomerulosclerosis and nephropathy association with HIV. In this group, the disease develops in early age, progress fast, and confess less renal survive in the long time. Is a great problem clinical in this group. Is a higher rate mortality. And the mutation, next, Susie, is only in black people. In this map, the map shows where the mutation is found, the mutation, okay? It's a speculation that evaluation of critical factor of survival related to Trypanosoma rhodinense in sub-Saharan area could have contributed to the higher rates of kidney disease in population with that ancestry. G1 in Western Africa, and G2 distributed in Western and Eastern Africa. Here. Next, Susie. It's the object is my study. The location Africa where mutation is found is also the place from where the black population came to Brazil. But the black population came to Brazil and not the black population from United States or other countries. And the population from Africa come Brazil have the mutation is a question. Next, Susie. Água, por favor. Brazil is the last country in the world to abolish slavery in 1888, and there were no public policy for this population. We are 53% of the population, and we have the work life, health, employment, housing, and life quality dictation. This is a result of long period of slavery. Next, Susie. Based on the recent epidemiologic data and molecular analysis, the genetic investigation of gene APOL1 in Brazilian Afro descendants justified this research to identify the risk level of this patient population. The accurate interpretation of genotype APOL1 is an useful tool to predict the occurrence of different nephropathies. Is a fundamental to adapt a clinical management strategy so that we can prevent the progression and reduce the risk of kidney disease in Brazilian African descendants by planning public health intervention to his population. Is the principal point for my study. It's important study for your knowledge on there is no published paper exploring this subject in Brazil. The professors explaining say about soul races in the health and the eyes for the black population. Susie, please, the press. Brazilian African descendant, why the high risk genotype G1, G2 variants of the APOL1 gene have a higher prevalence of kidney disease, many chronic renal disease, association with arterial hypertension or primary focal and segmental glomerulosclerosis. To determine the prevalence of APOL1, high risk type 1 to 2 combination, and the long list genotype in Brazilian Afro-descendant patients carrying chronic kidney disease, association with systemic arterial hypertension or primary focal segmental and focal glomerulosclerosis compared to healthy Brazilian African descendant individuals. My study is a case control. Case is a self-declared Black Afro-descendant patient carrying chronic disease and
She disappeared. Celia? No.
I'm advising her to turn off the camera, because maybe if she turns off her camera, it's better. But I don't know if she saw my message.
Celia, can you hear us? No, I'm not sure we will be able to finish this presentation. Ruqaiijah, what do you think about? Ruqaiijah, what do you think about it? Shall we wait or close the audio?
I think that if there are still some questions, we can open to questions again. Otherwise, we will do as you said. We are going to record.
Yeah, I think it's better. I will invite everybody who has questions, even speakers, if you want to make some additional comments or ask something else. And in the meantime, I will ask Alice to show her effort, sorry. We have seen while you can take the floor. Of course, you are not okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Welcome.
So, hi everybody. Thank you so much to the speakers. It was extremely interesting. So, again, I am very ignorant on the matter, but yes, I thank Carlo for inviting me and everybody for illuminating me on these subjects. So you can tell I'm not good with words, so I try to talk with images. This is the
Alicia, we are not seeing your screen.
Oh, really? My camera is on.
Yeah, there is also with you there are some connection problem.
Sorry. Susie, the last show, please.
Celia, we think it's better to record your intervention and then we put on the YouTube. What do you think about it? Because we stopped it several times.
Okay, Carlo. Okay.
Sorry, it's
okay.
I want to say thank you for your effort. You were really determined to speak, and I'm so sorry for this, but
I'm so sorry.
it's
I'm
technology. It was not your
Yes,
fault.
yeah. I'm so sorry.
Thank
I'm
you
so sorry.
again. We will
Okay,
record it
okay.
and made available.
Okay,
So thanks to say.
okay. Okay.
Okay, let's enjoy this drawing. Alice, talk. You can.
Shall we try again? Let's see if
Yeah.
it. Oh, okay. Yeah, I can see it. I'm connected with two screens, so I can actually check. I cannot see it properly. No, okay, it's all right. So here you should be able to see the first drawings from Professor Mevorach. And yes, so I mean, I'm not gonna comment too much, but she talked about racing through the genetics, her course, and how actually what struck me the most was like the concept that when we talk about race, what we actually talk about is racism. And so here you see it's like looking through a pair of dirty glasses, like you cannot really see reality because you have something else in mind, and you actually look for causes and you through studies you look for the confirmation to your theories and not actually to reality. So it was really interesting for me, this concept. Also, Professor Yearby here is so yeah, here are the couple of examples of studies which Professor Mevorach mentioned. And here you can see Professor Yearby's talk, where it's striking to me how race, the concept of race and what we actually think of it can initiate the result of studies. So, and also like, how can we define it? So she was mentioning skin color or self-identification. You know, there are different factors, but because that's not a real concept. And actually, to me, that's striking how much energy we put into proving that this is not real. Why do we think it is real? It's surprising to me, and yeah. So here is disease, and yes, and I'm sorry, but the talk from
was
not complete, but I will listen to it and I will
complete.
drawings, and yes, it will be, I'm sure, extremely interesting.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you to you, Alice. We will collect all your drawing and publish all together at the end of the seminar series. We will make them really available to all participants and everybody. So thanks again. If there are not any questions, I will close. I would like really to say thanks to all our speakers and also to our participants, to the students of Ruqaiijah. And unfortunately, we are sorry for the technical problems, but it's not our fault. It's just a matter of technology. So we are looking forward to meet all of you for the next seminar, 22 of April. So thanks again, and stay active against racism. Goodbye. Ciao.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.